It began with a farmer who just wanted to feed his family. No military training, no scientific background, just mud on his boots and calluses on his hands. Yet within a decade, his accidental creation would evolve into a weapon that made the Nazis rethink their entire strategy. A weapon so simple, so devastating, that Hitler's engineers scrambled to copy it, but never could. And the craziest part? It all started with a broken plow and a stubborn idea. In the small Danish countryside before the war, farmers didn't think much about politics. They thought about seasons, soil, and survival. Among them was a quiet man named Søren Sørensen, known in the village for fixing anything with wheels or metal. His land wasn't large, but he was proud of it. He had a gift for mechanics, often staying up late to repair tractors and threshers for his neighbors. When one of them joked that he should have been born an engineer, he'd laugh and say, "Engineers think too much. Farmers just make it work." But then came 1939. The air was different, heavier. German voices were heard more often at the border. And soon, the world was on fire. Denmark tried to stay neutral, but neutrality doesn't stop tanks. When the Wehrmacht rolled in, most surrendered without a fight. Soldiers were everywhere, occupying fields, barns, and homes. Farmers like Søren were told to keep producing food for the Reich. Disobey, and your farm was gone, or worse. At first, Søren did what everyone did, kept his head down. He plowed, he planted, he harvested. But deep down, something was changing. Every morning he saw German trucks rumbling past, loaded with grain that should have fed Danish families. Every night he heard rumors of resistance groups forming in nearby towns, ordinary men and women doing the impossible. That stirred something in him. He wasn't a soldier, but he knew machines, and machines could fight in their own way. One evening, his plow broke. Normally, that would have been a frustrating but ordinary problem. But that night, frustration turned to inspiration. He'd been tinkering with new types of steel blades, trying to make his plow more efficient. The snapped piece in his hand had curved edges that reminded him of something, shrapnel from a German shell he'd once seen. That shape, that curve, it tore through soil the same way metal tore through armor. And that's when the thought hit him, what if metal meant for farming could be repurposed for something else entirely? In his small workshop behind the barn, he began experimenting. It started innocent enough. He welded bits of old farm tools together, not knowing he was laying the foundation for a weapon. He didn't call it that, of course. To him it was the tool, something to fight back without firing a bullet. He combined the frame of an old harrow with a makeshift pressure mechanism, a design inspired by the way his tractor engine released steam. The result was crude, unstable, and dangerous. But it worked. The first time he tested it, the explosion was small, just enough to knock over a wooden crate. But in that moment, Søren realized he'd stumbled onto something far bigger than a plow. The device could be buried in the ground, disguised among roots and mud, and triggered by weight. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't military grade, but it was invisible. He'd just built an early version of what the world would later call a landmine. The idea spread quietly. One night, two men from the Danish resistance came knocking. They'd heard whispers about a farmer who could make the earth fight back. At first, Søren hesitated. He wasn't a fighter, but they told him about trains full of stolen food, about families executed for hiding Jews, about children starving while German officers feasted. That was the night Søren agreed to help. Not for glory, not for vengeance, but for balance. The resistance didn't have factories or funding. They had barns, scrap metal, and courage. And in those barns, Søren's invention evolved. He refined the design, making it smaller, deadlier, and easier to bury. The trigger mechanism, originally based on his tractor's pressure valve, was simplified so even a teenager could assemble it. Each mine was a ghost in the ground, waiting patiently beneath German boots. The first operation came in the spring of 1943. The target, a convoy route used by German trucks transporting ammunition. The mines were placed along a muddy stretch of road just before dawn. Hours later, the first explosion echoed through the hills. One truck flipped, then another. Soldiers panicked, firing into the trees, unsure where the attack had come from. There were no men in sight, no rifles, just the earth itself striking back. From that day, German patrols changed. They started walking differently, slower, more cautious, eyes on the ground. Fear had entered the equation, and that fear was worth more than any bullet. The Nazis began calling these devices the farmer's curse. They didn't know who made them, but they knew the pattern: quiet countryside roads that suddenly turned deadly. Even elite panzer units reported losses to these coast weapons. Soren's creation wasn't perfect. It was unpredictable, dangerous even to those who said it. But its simplicity made it powerful. Unlike factory-built weapons, it needed no blueprint, no rare materials, just scrap metal, fertilizer, and courage. Farmers across Denmark started making their own versions, tweaking the design, passing it along through resistance networks. By 1944, what started as a broken plow had become a nationwide weapon of defiance. The Germans tried to adapt. They sent engineers to disarm the mines, but they couldn't predict the variety. Some used wooden casings to avoid detection by metal detectors. Others were disguised as farming tools or buried beneath hay. It was psychological warfare on a new level. Soldiers began to mistrust even the ground they walked on. Every step could be their last. Some refused to patrol rural routes altogether. But with every victory came greater danger. The Gestapo grew desperate to find the man behind the design. They started raiding farms, burning barns, interrogating anyone rumored to be part of the resistance. Soren knew it was only a matter of time before they came for him. He hid his workshop tools under bales of hay and buried the prototypes in a dry well. Yet even then he didn't stop. He began writing his designs on thin strips of cloth and smuggling them through fishing boats to Britain, where Allied engineers could study and replicate them. Those drawings reached London in late 1943. When British scientists saw the simplicity and effectiveness of the mechanism, they were stunned. They refined it further and began producing what became known as the Buttercup mine, modeled directly after Soren's idea. Cheap, effective, and terrifyingly easy to deploy. These mines would later be used across Europe to slow German reinforcements and protect advancing Allied troops. It wasn't just a Danish weapon anymore, it was a farmer's idea turned into a strategic revolution. By the time D-Day arrived, Soren's invention had quietly changed the rhythm of war. The Germans had to divert engineers, delay operations, and move slower than ever before, all because of one man's plow-inspired design. And while he never saw the full scale of his creation's impact, resistance members whispered his name in secret, calling him the blacksmith of freedom. What's haunting, though, is that Soren himself never wanted to kill. He saw his device as a way to reclaim control, a weapon not of aggression, but of defiance. When the war ended and the fields were finally free, he refused to build another one. He returned to farming, quietly, as if nothing had happened. Yet for years afterward, soldiers and civilians alike would uncover remnants of his work buried beneath the soil, silent, rusting reminders of how one man's stubbornness can change the course of history. Freedom had returned to Denmark, but peace didn't come easy. The fields that once fed families were now graveyards of steel. Every farmer feared the sound of a shovel striking metal, the echo of a war that refused to die. Soren spent years helping dismantle what he had built. Every mine dug up was a reminder that even the most righteous invention could outlive its purpose. But history doesn't stop where people wish it would. Across Europe, armies had taken his design, adapted it, and multiplied it by thousands. The weapon born in his barn had escaped his control, and it was about to change modern warfare forever. In the aftermath of the war, military scientists across the world dissected everything the resistance had used. They called it asymmetric warfare, a polite term for desperate ingenuity. The British had their Buttercup. The Soviets created their PMK series. The Americans refined their anti-tank mines. But all of them had one thing in common: simplicity. It was a lesson the farmer had unknowingly taught the world. Power didn't come from complexity. It came from accessibility, a weapon anyone could make, anywhere, with anything. Reports started to surface from North Africa, from Eastern Europe, from the Pacific Islands. Old concepts were being reborn. In the chaos of post-war conflicts, fragments of Soren's design, his curved metal plates, his pressure triggers, kept reappearing. Some claimed it was coincidence. Others knew better. His design had traveled in whispers, in notebooks, in half-remembered sketches drawn by men who'd once fought beside the Danes. In a way, it had gone viral long before the internet ever existed. Meanwhile, Soren was a ghost in his own story. He refused interviews. He turned down invitations from allied governments to work as a consultant. To him, fame was another kind of occupation, one that trapped you in what you'd done instead of who you were. When asked by a young journalist about the landmines, he said something that later appeared in Danish archives. A tool only becomes evil when it forgets what it was meant to fix. Those words would be quoted in military ethics debates decades later. But even in his silence, the legend grew. Soldiers told stories about the farmer who made the ground itself fight. In Germany, captured Wehrmacht officers during post-war interrogations mentioned how terrified their units had been. Not of tanks, not of planes, but of invisible enemies hiding beneath their feet. One officer described it perfectly. "We stopped trusting the earth, and when a man can't trust the earth, he can't march anymore." Soren's invention had introduced a new dimension of warfare: psychological paralysis. You couldn't see it, you couldn't reason with it, and you couldn't predict it. Every step became a gamble, every movement a question of fate. It wasn't just about explosions, it was about uncertainty. That was its true power. And long after the guns fell silent, that fear persisted. Civilians returning home to rebuild would tread carefully, literally and emotionally, unsure of what still lingered beneath their feet. Years later, during the early Cold War, NATO scientists studying resistance tactics rediscovered Soren's design. They analyzed the original sketches recovered from Danish archives and noticed something chilling. It could be built using components from nearly any civilian machinery, tractors, cars, even bicycles. That revelation changed defense strategy. Suddenly, nations realized they didn't need massive armies to deter invasion. Just enough clever engineers and enough metal to make the ground untrustworthy. The principle of deterrence through fear had taken root, and the seed was sown by a man who once only wanted to fix a plow. But not all consequences were noble. In Southeast Asia, during the Vietnam War, crude variants of landmines, descendants of Soren's design, covered entire jungles. Soldiers called them bouncing betties, toe poppers, bamboo bombs. They were easy to make, terrifying to face, and devastating to remove. The farmer's invention, now evolved far beyond recognition, was being used in wars he never would have approved of. It had become the people's weapon, the farmer's revenge, repurposed by both the oppressed and the oppressor. There's a haunting irony to it. The man who created a weapon to defend his land had inspired weapons that made countless lands unlivable. Decades after the war, long after Soren's death, children in Cambodia, Afghanistan, and Bosnia would still lose limbs to what was, in essence, his idea. The world had learned his lesson too well, that simplicity can be more dangerous than sophistication. Yet, there's another side to this story, a quieter one, almost poetic. In the same villages that once used his weapon for war, engineers began using his principles for peace. Pressure mechanisms similar to his were repurposed for early warning systems, flood detectors, and agricultural machines. In a strange way, the farmer's tool had come full circle. The same mechanical logic that made land deadly was now being used to protect it. Historians would later call Soren's invention a, quote, moral paradox of engineering, because it represented the duality of human innovation, how necessity breeds brilliance, and brilliance can breed both salvation and destruction. His story became a case study in military ethics courses. They debated whether he should be remembered as a hero or as a cautionary tale. But to those who truly understood him, the answer was both. He was a man caught between creation and consequence, like a blacksmith forging light in the middle of darkness. In his final years, Soren rarely spoke about the war. He lived in a small farmhouse, surrounded by fields that had finally grown quiet. But sometimes, at dusk, villagers would see him walking the land with a metal detector, scanning for remnants of the past. Not because he feared them, but because he didn't want anyone else to. When he passed away in the 1960s, they buried him under an oak tree, his favorite spot on the farm. Locals say that before the burial, a group of old resistance fighters laid a single rusted pressure plate beside his coffin, a reminder of the invention that saved them and the burden he carried for it. Years later, when his farm was turned into a small museum, visitors found one final message etched into his old workbench. It wasn't a confession or an apology. Just 6 words, engraved into the wood by hand: "Never again should soil fear men." Those words became the museum's motto, carved above the entrance, a fitting tribute to a man who taught the world that even the simplest inventions can change everything, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon is the one built not out of hate, but out of necessity. But the story didn't end there. History, as it often does, found a way to twist even the quietest legacies into something larger. Decades after Soren's death, a team of military historians from the UK stumbled across a set of forgotten intelligence documents in the National Archives. Inside were sketches, coded letters, and photographs marked property of the SOE, Britain's Special Operations Executive. Among them, a curious note written in fading ink: "Source: Danish farmer. Weapon disguised as plow implement. Potential use against German supply convoys. Field success confirmed." For years, nobody had truly known how far his idea had traveled, but these files revealed the reach. His designs had been smuggled not just to Britain, but to France, Norway, and even Poland. In each country, local resistance movements had modified his farm weapon to fit their own terrain. In Poland, it was used to sabotage railway tracks. In France, to cripple armored cars. In Norway, it was hidden beneath snow-covered roads to disrupt German fuel convoys. Each version carried a whisper of Soren's fingerprints, his simple, pressure-triggered design born from a farmer's mind and necessity's hand. And what's even more extraordinary is that the Allies never knew the man's full name. He was simply codenamed Blacksmith. To them, he was an idea, not a person. Yet that anonymity may have been his greatest armor. Because while generals got medals and speeches, the farmer got something rarer: freedom from becoming a symbol. His invention could spread without politics, without ego, without ownership. And maybe that's why it survived. But the darker truth is that after the war, the world didn't let go of his legacy. Instead, it industrialized it. Factories began mass-producing mines by the millions, selling them under the logic of defense. They became cheaper than bullets, easier to hide, harder to detect. They were used in conflicts far removed from Europe, places Soren had never heard of: Angola, Afghanistan, Syria. Each explosion a faint echo of the night. A Danish farmer stood in his barn, testing an idea he thought might defend his home. The line between defense and devastation had blurred beyond recognition. Still, there were those who remembered what his invention was originally meant to be: a weapon of resistance, not domination. In the 1980s, a Danish journalist named Ingrid Rask began researching the mysterious figure known as Blacksmith. She traveled to old farms, spoke with aging veterans, and dug through declassified files. Slowly, she pieced together his life, uncovering the full story behind the myth. When her documentary aired, it didn't portray him as a hero or a villain. It portrayed him as human. A man who wanted to feed his family, saw his land stolen, and found power in the one thing he understood: the mechanics of the earth. The documentary sparked a global conversation. Anti-landmine movements used Soren's story as both inspiration and warning. Activists would hold signs reading "From Plow to Peace" during protests. His name began appearing in speeches alongside those of scientists and inventors who never intended their creations for war. Because the truth was timeless, every great tool holds two shadows: what it's used for and what it could become. By the 1990s, as nations gathered to sign the Ottawa Treaty banning landmines, Denmark sent a symbolic exhibit to the conference. It included one of Soren's original prototype casings restored from his farm. The Danish delegate spoke briefly, saying, quote, "This began as a farmer's defense against tyranny. It became the tyranny itself. Today, we return it to the earth." The applause that followed wasn't for victory, it was for irony, for tragedy, and for redemption all at once. And yet, despite the sorrow attached to it, there was something profoundly human about his story. It reminded people that innovation is never truly controllable. Once an idea is born, it lives beyond you, shaped by fear, necessity, or greed. Soren's weapon had terrified one of history's most powerful armies, and in doing so, it proved a truth that still unsettles generals. The greatest threats don't come from laboratories or high command. They come from ordinary people who refuse to accept powerlessness. Imagine that. A man who never saw a battlefield changed the way battlefields were fought. A man who only wanted to fix his plow ended up breaking an empire's confidence. That's the kind of paradox history doesn't create often. And even though he's long gone, traces of his mind remain in every military engineer who studies improvised defense, in every humanitarian who works to clear forgotten minds, and in every thinker who asks whether human progress is worth the price it demands. Sometimes, when people visit his farm museum, they don't expect much. It's small, quiet, surrounded by barley fields swaying in the wind. But those who step inside often leave changed, because in the corner of the workshop sits a single rusted object, the original broken plow blade that started it all. The metal is warped, pitted by time, but still sharp enough to catch the light. Beneath it, a small plaque reads, "Even the simplest thing can change the world." And that's the point. Sorensen didn't set out to change the world, he set out to fix what was broken. The difference between invention and revolution was just circumstance. When people talk about the heroes of World War II, they think of generals, resistance leaders, politicians. But the real heroes are often the ones who never called themselves that. The farmers, the mechanics, the mothers who hid soldiers in barns, the children who carried messages through forests. Soren was one of them, proof that power doesn't always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly in a workshop, beneath a single flickering light, as a man stares at a piece of broken steel and thinks, there has to be a better way. And maybe that's why his story still matters. Because somewhere, right now, another ordinary person is standing in front of something broken, something everyone else has given up on, and wondering how to fix it. They don't know it yet, but that small act of defiance might just change everything again.